female warrior. Thank you. It would be a very different talk if it were, since the only female warrior I can recall from the 15th century is Joan of Arc. We will briefly encounter Joan further in, but what drew me to this topic is thinking about how medieval women coped with the wars that took away their husbands, their sons, their homes, and sometimes all three. The history books about this period typically spend most of their time tracking what was happening to the men, which makes sense, of course, because the men were the ones who were planning and marching and fighting and dying. But if that meant that back home, the women had to step in to manage jobs that their men usually took care of, as well as managing their own usual tasks, including the raising and managing of children. And they had to worry about where their husbands and sons and brothers were, about how they were doing, about if they were alive. This is something, of course, that some women have to worry about today, because there are still plenty of wars to worry about, and it's still mostly men who fight in them. But what drew me into this topic is an odd, non-modern fact, which is that most medieval women whose husbands were off fighting didn't necessarily care so much about the men's fate, about if their husband would live or die. Instead, the women were usually focused on the survival of their household and the successes of their children. Excuse me. What created the situation was the practice of arranged marriages. As romantic as medieval England can appear in romance novels and modern movies today, medieval couples were generally created through the action of their parents, who would negotiate the fates of their children by arguing over such unromantic issues as dowries and manorial properties. The prospective bride and groom did not necessarily even meet before the deeds were drawn up. One famous example from 1477 is John Paston III, an upper-class man from Norfolk, who had to sit out a series of failed would-be marriage arrangements until his parents finally found another couple that they agreed with. It was only at that point that John in any way connected with Marjorie Bruce, his wife-to-be. And that was through a letter she sent him, because she, of course, had also never met him. Excuse me. Famously, though, Marjorie had apparently been exposed to some romantic medieval stories, locked up in her room or wherever she was, since she addressed her husband-to-be as her right well-beloved Valentine. The teenage Marjorie was relatively lucky in that her prospective husband was only 33 years old. Compare that to Alison, also known as the Wife of Bath, a character in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who was married off at the age of 12. That would mean that her parents had put her onto the marriage market at the earliest possible moment, as age 12 was the minimum age at which the Christian Church, in principle at least, would allow girls to marry and to consummate the marriage. As Chaucer presented things, the wife's parents had carefully selected a husband who was, as a wife explains to her fellow pilgrims, good, rich, and old. Whatever Alison thought from the family's point of view, rich and old were very desirable traits, since they meant that the husband would die soon, leaving his goods and money to his young wife and her family of origin. Accordingly, Alison's first husband was succeeded in quick succession by two other good, rich, and old men. And from that point, Alison had become old enough and had inherited enough to choose her own husbands and lovers. A final example is Elizabeth de Burgh, heiress of her deceased father's extensive lands and heiress-to-be of her grandmother's enormous fortune. Elizabeth was a baby when her father, William de Burgh, the third Earl of Ulster, was killed in Ireland. Elizabeth's mother fled with her child back to London, where Edward III, who managed to equip and support his 5 sons by marrying them off to heiresses, naturally grabbed Elizabeth, placed her in the royal household, and in due course betrothed her to his third son, Lionel of Antwerp. Lionel was all of 4 years old when he married the 10-year-old Elizabeth, though, of course, they did not establish marital relationships until they were considerably older. So one way or another, women or girls ended up finding themselves attached to men or boys that they hadn't chosen. Over time, some women may have found themselves truly loving their husband and or being loved by him. More often, possibly and probably, they simply accepted the situation, did their best to preserve and improve the household and its reputation. So, a little drink. To explore this lost world of 14th century England, I'm going to concentrate on two upper-class women, Alice Chaucer and Margaret of Anjou. Both were married off by parents, both lost husbands, both had only sons whom they treasured. One came to a more or less happy ending, the other lost everything. As you've probably figured out, Alice Chaucer was a descendant of the poet and courtier Geoffrey Chaucer. Specifically, he was her grandfather. Geoffrey himself was the son of a successful wine merchant or vintner. He grew up in London in his father's house on the banks of the Thames River. John Chaucer's family probably started out as tradesmen. The name Chaucer is an anglicization of the French word chaussier, or shoemaker. But the Chaucers had gradually worked their way up the social ladder, and by the time Geoffrey was born, his father was chief vintner to King Edward. As soon as Geoffrey was old enough, John Chaucer wrangled his son a job as page to none other than the aforementioned Elizabeth de Burgh. Once he was older, Geoffrey advanced to being an esquire in the king's household. There he met and married Philippa de Rowett, a lady-in-waiting for Edward's queen. Geoffrey and Philippa had 4 children, one of whom, Thomas, became a close friend and supporter of Edward III's grandson, Henry IV, and of Henry IV's son, Henry V. And we are getting into deep Shakespeare here, if you know your Shakespeare history plays. Over his long career, Thomas Chaucer held many official positions in the royal administration, including serving 5 times as Speaker of the House of Commons. I'll move over to, is that the tune thing? Or maybe
it's that one.
It's that one. Okay,
Yeah.
just stick with that one.
Okay.
Okay, and Thomas Chaucer also accumulated considerable wealth via an arranged marriage to the heiress Matilda or Maud Burgers. Maud brought him extensive property, including 2 manors in Ewelme, Oxfordshire. Their only child, Alice, who was probably born at Ewelme, would remain linked to the place throughout her life. I will say that having taught Chaucer and read Chaucer and done a lot of Chaucer, you never hear about Alice. So that's particularly why I wanted to talk about Alice now. Okay, husband number 1, John Philip, Sir John Philip, circa 1380 to 1415. Thomas's daughter is first recorded on October 21st, 1414, when, though younger than the canonical 12 years old, she was already the 3rd wife of the 34-year-old Sir John Philip, who was a comrade of Henry V. Alice's father had presumably taken the opportunity to enrich his daughter by marrying her off to the wealthy Philip. And you can't really know whether she actually had to marry him at age 12 and actually have sex with him at age 12. There are other stories or accounts in which a young girl is brought into the household and she just sort of grows up a bit and waits until she, everyone waits till she's old enough to actually get married. So, but we don't know. Now, I'm going to have to pause before diving further to explain about the 2 wars that are involved here. 2 back-to-back wars over the 14th and 15th century, the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, and the War of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. So these are the wars that took the men that the women had to do without. The 100 Years' War came about because the King of France, Charles IV, died in 1328 without a male successor. From the English point of view, that meant that England now owned France, because Edward III's mother, Isabella, was Charles's sister. So she's the only French royal left standing. So logically, Edward thought that he was the natural heir of France through his mother. Meanwhile, the French were busy switching the kingship over to a male, Philip, Count of Valois, who was a cousin of Charles. Philip and his advisors declared that rulership could not legally pass into female hands. And Edward rejected that claim, and so the war began. This is more Shakespeare, if you know Shakespeare. Next one is the, oh, sorry, stay where it's right, Philip. Is that where we are?
Oh, be the next one.
Okay, the mid-14th century Black Death slowed down the fighting, but once the plague receded, the English took up their cause again. And this is where Alice lost her first husband. In 1415, only a year after her marriage to Philip, Henry V, the grandson of Edward III, gathered his troops and stormed into France, attacking the town of Harfleur. Again, because the English thought that they should properly own France, and the French disagreed. Henry and his brother, Thomas of Lancaster, won the battle, but among the many who didn't survive was John Philip, dead of what was called the flux, what we now call dysentery. John's body was brought back to England to be entombed next to his second wife, Matilda, and her first husband, Waltoxy. So if you're looking at are they looking at this now? Mm-hmm. You're looking at the three images from a church burial plaque. So women also got killed. Women probably died often in childbirth. And she had already had a husband. So there's going through this time period, there's just lots of switching out of people dying and remarrying and so on. Okay, where am I? Yeah, and so the inscription, so John Philip is not particularly considered, but does say that he fought courageously and well at the siege of Harfleur and endured the power of death. So for me, when I was putting this together, I was wondering what Alice thought. So she'd been kind of handed over to this man at age 12 and had eventually to kind of deal with him. And was she just happy that he died? I mean, is that what women in medieval war would feel like? Or did she really like him well enough to actually miss him and love him? In either case, she came out of this well for her because of Philip's will. Alice received a gold cup and all the furniture in one of his rooms in his house, and she inherited some very valuable property. Although I'm getting this from a historian, the historian said it is probable, since she was still a minor, that she returned to her parental home and that her father was managing her property. So back to Thomas Chaucer. Back home, according to another historian, Carol Rawcliffe, there was, quote, no shortage of eminent suitors for the hand of Thomas's only daughter, who stood eventually to inherit all of his own possessions. But then I also wonder here, did Alice sort of, we were going to send her off to marry somebody again or not? In fact, she didn't remarry until fairly far from there. So I wonder if she just kind of made her parents let her just stay home for all that time period. I mean, you just have to imagine these things because nobody kept records on what the women were doing. Mm-hmm. Okay, husband number 2, Thomas Montague, 4th Earl of Salisbury. So that's this, and this is going to be a funny picture. Everybody laughs when they see it. So that's him and his first wife. And it's not the best picture, but I always think she looks like a poodle kind of, and he's going to take the poodle out and walk her around the garden. But actually, Thomas Montague was pretty buff and wonderful, and maybe some people think. In any case, it wasn't until Alice was fully grown by modern standards that she experienced married life again. Like her father, she was also moving up the social ranks. Now about 20 years old, she married the 40-year-old Montague sometime after 1421 and accompanied him to France, where he was one of the chief English commanders in the 100 Years' War. And quickly, the English were kind of settled in northern France, in Normandy, and particularly in the town of Rouen, which is where Joan of Arc was later burned. So that's where the English were kind of based. So the English are in France a lot for a long time. A well-known, possibly spurious story has Montague outraged when the Duke of Burgundy, Burgundy is just to the right of France on the map, the Duke Philip the Bold attempted to seduce Alice, apparently being very attracted to her. Rawcliffe, the historian, however, cynically remarks that, quote, there can be little doubt that Salisbury himself was attracted more by Alice's prospects as an heiress than her physical attributes, which is another funny thing about women and female historians of the present. They never want to just agree that, yeah, she's pretty and the guy chased her, but you have to say, no, he was after her money, or why couldn't he do both? I don't know. But in any case, at this distant point, it is difficult to decide if the still immature Alice was more interested in flirting with Philip than with clinging to her husband. But she certainly, this kind of runs through some of the later stuff. She was apparently attractive. So she got into these kinds of things. Okay, this one now. Whatever the nature of their relationship, Alice and Montague's marriage ended abruptly 4 years later at the siege of Orleans. On October 27, 1428, Montague was standing behind the iron grating of a window in a tower overlooking the city when he was struck by debris from a cannonball, which tore away much of his lower face. And you can see on the picture that this was represented in a manuscript later. He presumably is peering out of one of those windows. It took a week for Montague to die. So Montague, Salisbury, these guys all have like 3 different names, but anyway, Montague, Salisbury, whoever. His will provided for a tomb in England, memorializing himself and his first wife, the poodle, as well as Alice, quote, if she would, that is, if she wanted to be buried with him. But apparently she didn't. So that didn't happen, which may or may not reflect on her feelings about her second husband. And he left her a lot of properties, and she certainly accepted all of those properties. So Alice is kind of building number 1, number 2. Now we're going to get to number 3. But so anyway, to pause, this is another point about medieval women and war. Whatever they may have felt about their husbands, the frequent death in war of these husbands meant that the widows accumulated considerable wealth. So it's kind of to the advantage of these women in a way. And this wealth, along with any other features of these women, such as beauty and any other inheritances, would serve to attract potential future husbands. From among these potential husbands, a clever woman could choose someone a step or more above her previous husband. Thus, we've watched Alice moving from a mere baron, John Philip, to an earl, Thomas Montague, and now she's going on to William de Pole, who's an earl, and later a marquis or marquis, depending how you want to say that, and finally a Duke of Suffolk. So Duke is the highest you can get without being royalty. So she goes from pretty minor person all the way up to the top as she could get. So husband number 3 was William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, 1396 to 1450. And according to another Alice scholar, Marjorie Anderson, so when you're a medieval man, military man or something, you get called by where you're from. So he isn't called William, he's called Suffolk. Okay, so Suffolk and Montague had been friends and companions in arms during the French wars, which is probably how Suffolk came to know and admire Alice. So Suffolk has met her before, sees she's pretty, realizes she's rich, finds out after her husband dies that she's even richer. And so he was possibly thinking for any of these good reasons that he would want to marry her. But first of all, he was captured by Joan of Arc. So yeah, I'm going to go to Joan of Arc. This picture is obviously not a medieval one, but it's a nice Victorian one.
Nice one, yeah. It is nice.
And so that's our one encounter of an actual female warrior in this story. So she took Suffolk as a prisoner, and set up an enormous ransom that he would have to come up with to free himself. So Suffolk had to sell land in both France and England to do this, and to further gather the rest of the money he needed, he was allowed to return back to England to take possession of his estates and to seek a rich wife. Okay, so this is kind of turning the tables on this. So the man is going to go after the woman with the wife. By November 1430, he was back in England and married to Alice Chaucer. And can we have the next one?
Mhm.
So I just wanted to give you some idea of where he is. He's called Suffolk, and I can't point to this to you, but
Yeah.
you can see Suffolk on the map. So he's the Earl of Suffolk, and up above him, if he were the Earl up there, he'd be the Earl of Norfolk.
Yeah.
Norfolk is the North folk, Suffolk is the South folk, right? And this is what's called East Anglia, kind of sticks out into the North Sea at the side of England. So anyway, he was the Earl of Suffolk, and later on he's going to get more property than that. All right, so Suffolk has returned to England. He's gone back to Suffolk, and he's gone back to, or he is found and married to Alice Chaucer. She was 28, he was 36, so that's kind of a nice age for the two of them to settle in with. And Alice, all right, because Alice was now married to this important earl, the Privy Council of England decided to make her a garter holder, right? Most people know the garter, the Order of the Garter, this, like, it's actually a belt or something that you would wrap around you. And so it's mostly men that would have that, but she was one of the few women that was granted the, quote, distinguished privilege against the ensuing feast of St. George to wear the Order of a Garter. And women, I guess men would wear it on the right side, women wear it on the left side, and you'll see it later. Okay. So let's go to this with okay. I couldn't put together a nice sort of medieval map for that, but this is a driving map. But so if you look over on the far right, I'm not good with
Far right by Colchester.
by Ipswich. Like the red
yes,
dot
up
is.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ipswich is Suffolk. That's where William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, would hang out. And then if you kept driving, you'd get to Ewell, and that's sort of Alice's area, landscape, whatever. So they lived in two pretty separated places. I mean, you can drive that apparently now in about 3 hours, but that would take a lot longer.
How long did
in the
it take
Middle Ages.
then?
I don't know, but I don't know enough about how much, what land they owned and how they went back and forth with things. But so they owned a chunk of East Anglia, and they owed a chunk of Oxfordshire, which was Ewell, and that'll come in later. Okay, so one of the things that they apparently managed to do together in Ewell is that she and her husband founded a school, founded a church in 1437. 1448, they added a grammar school. And this is important sort of to the story because of what's going to happen at the end of this talk, if in fact we all survive that far. Okay, so Alice and William marry on November 4, 1444. Alice, that's September 27, 1442. They had their first and only child. It's called John. And then on November 4, 1444, Alice was promised the guardianship of her child in the event of Suffolk's early death, which is a very medieval thing, because if she died without this important privilege, that meant she would be allowed to raise her son herself as a femme sole, a lone woman, a woman without a husband. Usually the family would take it back, especially if it's a boy, which it was, right? So fairly quickly, their marriage, combining Suffolk's rise to power over East Anglia and Alice's father's lands and connections in Ewell, made them both important people within the royal household. Since the current King of England, Henry VI, was only 8 years old at this point, the country had to be managed entirely by councillors such as Suffolk, who was chosen to serve in the king's household and about the king's person. And I will get to this one. So you can see in this picture that it's faint. The lines are faint, but it's very nicely drawn. Which is why I made it that funny color, because that was the best I could manage to bring out the lines. So there's little Henry in his mother's arms. So unfortunately, this sort of happy situation didn't last. The child Henry was, in the sense, a double orphan. His father, Henry V, died in France in 1422, another victim of the flux, and his mother, Henry V's French wife, Catherine of Valois, he had married her in order to kind of consolidate his alleged taking over of France, or at least of Normandy, and brought her back, and she had this child. But then after her husband died, she was generally mistreated by all the English lords and whatnot, who did not trust having this French woman around. And so she just abandoned her 2-year-old son and went off with a Welshman. No doubt there must have been other women, apart from the disappeared Catherine, watching over the young Henry. But given her husband's involvement and access to the king, Alice probably also played a part in raising and educating the child. So she and William have kind of got as pretty high as you can get without, again, being royalty. Okay, next one. So that kind of is the Alice story. Alice kind of hits the top. And now I'm going to talk about Margaret, who is French and brought over to England. So on May 24, 1444, Margaret of Anjou married Henry VI. So that's that little baby grown up somewhat to 24 years old. And that the marriage itself was arranged by Suffolk, by and large, this because he had previously engaged with Margaret's father, who was called René d'Anjou. Anyone? Mm-hmm. So this is a picture of René d'Anjou writing a book. Mm-hmm. Don't have a picture of Margaret. Oh, I do a little later, actually. Yeah. And so he was very eccentric, sort of famously eccentric kind of character, and was happy to send his 15-year-old daughter off to France to marry Henry VI. Henry VI, unfortunately, had some kind of mental issue. So it was not a very
little garden in there. Sorry. Like the garden around the back is beautiful.
Oh yeah,
this is beautiful. Yeah.
If you follow that red wall,
yeah,
and all the way it goes along,
it goes back there.
At the very end. It's his like pinpoint. He's giving his book to the guy that he's writing the book from.
Oh, okay, back there.
This is an art historian, folks.
Okay.
No, that's very good. You can do that anytime you want. Okay. Despite a negligible dowry and empty titles to lands over which her father had no control, according to another historian, Margaret was a strategic choice for the English in their pursuit of a conclusion to the 100 Years' War, and she was betrothed to Henry IV in 1444. Of course, as usual, she had never met him, and he had never met her. Okay, now we do this one, and then we'll do that one. Suffolk, now elevated from Earl to Marquis, which I think is how you pronounce it in England, oversaw the procession from France to England. So you can imagine it was a big deal. He rode ahead of Margaret's chariot, representing King Henry, while Alice, now a marchioness, represented the new queen-to-be. Now, in this picture you're looking at, it's from a manuscript called the Shrewsbury manuscript, because the guy giving her the book is the Earl of Shrewsbury, John Talbot. And this was all done in Rouen, that I was talking about, in Normandy. And so it is supposedly Henry on the left, mm-hmm. holding hands with Margaret on the right. But of course, mm-hmm. Henry was in England, and he wasn't there. So they just pretended that he was there to make the nice picture. Mm-hmm. And an interesting fact about this, and sad fact, is that she's being given this beautiful book, and she's just 15. And you can imagine the princess gets this beautiful book, and it's going to be stories and pictures and rules for women should wear or do. And it's not. It's all about war. And it's all about war and governance, because Henry VI was inept. Henry VI had some kind of mental deficiency. He was a very kind and sweet person, but he could not possibly lead a battle or do any such thing. So they were giving her a book to this 15-year-old girl that would teach her how to be a warrior, strangely and sadly enough. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, going back to William, the Earl of Suffolk, is bringing Margaret back to England, where Henry is waiting, and they allowed to have feasts and triumphs and banquets, and she's treated with all this great ceremony, and the royal marriage finally took place April 23, 1445, and the coronation on May 30. Notably, neither of Margaret's parents, her parents, by the way, were separated. Neither of her parents or other relations seemed to have attended these events. So again, you can imagine a 15-year-old girl separated from everything she knew and brought among these strange people whose language she did not speak. And now she has to be a queen. So this is another aspect of medieval femaleness, particularly royal ones, arranged marriages where royal women are sent off to be married to princes and kings that they had never met, in countries they had never seen, where people spoke languages they could not understand. And all of this is built around the political needs of the men who controlled the system. So at least Margaret, age 15, had Alice, now 40 years old, available to be a kind of surrogate mother. I mean, I imagine that. Again, there's no letters or anything proving that, but it seemed like an obvious thing. If William was very much involved with taking care of Henry VI, Alice would take care of Margaret. So they were, I assume, friends. And meanwhile, Suffolk was also getting rewarded for his efforts. He was made a duke in 1448, and he marked the occasion by writing a will that expressed genuine love for his wife and son, which is a very rare thing to to find in this kind of material. So he says, I ordain my best beloved wife, my sole executrix, he wrote, beseeching her at the reverence of God to take a charge upon her for the weal of my soul. For above all the earth, my singular trust is most in her. ... Not reading all of it. And last of all, with the blessing of God and of me as heartily as I can give it, to my dear and true son, I bequeath him and his mother love and all good accord, and give him to her wholly. Says this kind of very sweet. Unfortunately, though, things began going poorly with governmental things. So now that Henry was 24 and potentially trying to have some of his own way for things, there were different groups of people. I don't personally know exactly all of why this happened. The king still liked Suffolk, but the people and some of the people within the government had become resentful of him, maybe because he had too much connection to Suffolk, to Henry. So finally, Suffolk was impeached by Parliament on charge of corruption and treachery. Henry tried to protect him, but the feeling against him was so strong that the most Henry could do was to suggest that Suffolk just leave for 5 years or so. And so then this happened. Suffolk went off on a ship heading for Calais in France. The ship was intercepted by another vessel whose captain took him on board and brought him back to Dover, which is the southern part of England, and had his head head chopped off. And this was the people expressing their dislike of this man.
So they intercepted him.
Yeah, there's two boats, one boat chasing the other and then getting him and bringing him back. Suffolk's head and body were rowed to the shore of Dover, where they were tossed onto the sand. Alice's reactions are not recorded, but it seems clear that from this point, she was done with husbands. She certainly did not marry again. Instead, her focus was on her 6-year-old son, John de la Pole. This involved her in the general effort among the female upper class of England to convince Margaret to beget an heir for England, for the, quote, noble fruit of your body, for the great trust and most comfortable certainty and health of this realm, and of the king's true, I'm having to translate here, true loving people of the same. And Margaret did finally have a son. And part of the problem for her having a son was that Henry VI didn't know anything about sex and didn't want to know anything about sex. He was very much into the church, and he was presumably very hard to seduce or to have babies with. So they had this one child who was called Edward of Westminster, born 1453. But the peace that the marriage of Margaret and Henry was supposed to create had not lasted From age 15 in 1445, Margaret was now 23, a mother, and confronting a double collapse of all the French territories except Calais and of her husband's mental state. The 100 Years' War had more or less worn away, but now the English were splitting into two camps, both descended from King Edward III, Lancastrians, who followed Henry VI, and Yorkists, who followed Richard, 3rd Duke of York. And this is a scene from Shakespeare, surprise, surprise, where these two dukes are getting into arguing with each other, and one pulls off a white rose and the other pulls off a red rose. And that's why you get the Lancastrians and the Yorkists and the Wars of the Roses. And more Shakespeare. Okay, not too much longer. Like Alice, Margaret's focus was on her son and his future. As the wars in France gave way to homegrown wars between Yorkists and Lancastrians, Margaret struggled to rebuild the Lancastrian affinity, maintain her husband's authority, and guard her son's inheritance. It was this period that earned Margaret her Shakespearean moniker as the she-wolf of France, with a tiger's heart wrapped in woman's hide. So think back to that book she got when she was 15, that she must have read it very carefully, right? There was no one else to do that. And she wanted her son to be king, right? In due course, Alice Chaucer, former Lancastrian, was so completely in the Yorkist camp by now that she had married her precious son John to the sister of York's successor, Edward IV. And it gets really hard to follow who's Lancastrian, who's York, and people kept switching sides. And so that's what Alice has done now, even though she was a Lancastrian, and she helped Margaret, who was a Lancastrian by marriage. At this point, Alice figured things are not going the right way for the Lancastrians. I have one marvelous son, and I've got to be married off to the right person. And okay, so after that, there was a battle, the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, in which the quote, she-wolf Margaret went into battle against Edward IV. So that's Lancastrian versus Yorkist, with the result that the Yorkists triumphed. And among the dead was her 17-year-old son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Both she and her royal husband were captured and taken to the Tower of London. Henry VI was found dead the next day, probably murdered on the orders of the new king, so no, Edward IV. What happened next was that Alice was this very ironic and sad, is that Alice was made Margaret's jailer in Wallingford Castle, which is a castle that Alice was the constable of. There are no records of their personal interactions, if any, but it would be fascinating and probably heartbreaking if we could have overheard any discussions between these two extraordinary women, both of whom had suffered so keenly and lost so much, except that Alice had lost only husbands, while keeping safe her precious son, whose wife went on to produce a full set of 11 children. Margaret of Anjou, on the other hand, had truly lost everything. And get a Margaret picture here. So I didn't include this, but Margaret stayed in custody in this castle for about 3 years, and then they released her to go to London. And this is a picture. She was adopted by the Fraternity of Our Lady of the Skinners Company of London, okay, which is one of these guilds that they have in England and in London. I'm not sure, and I don't think anyone knows exactly why she has this picture there, but there she is. Okay, so once she was allowed to leave England and go back to France, Margaret, let me get to where she's released from imprisonment and remained in England until Alice's death in 1475, and after which she's ransomed and returned to France by her cousin King Louis XI. Margaret lived on as a poor relation of her cousin until her death in 1482, aged 52. She was entombed next to her parents in Angers Cathedral, but her remains were removed and scattered by the revolutionaries who ransacked the cathedral during the French Revolution. So it's just completely wiped out as a person. The ultimate resolution of the years of war came via another Margaret, Margaret Beaufort, Alice's relation, to whom she had tentatively married her son John before switching him over to Elizabeth of York. which was maybe the wrong decision because as things turned out, but not a terribly wrong decision. The victory of Margaret Beaufort's son, Henry Tudor, over Richard III at Bosworth Field resulted in his coronation, in Henry's coronation as King Henry VII, who is the father of Henry VIII. So we are entering the Renaissance. Okay. Meanwhile, to end on a happier note, Alice and Suffolk's memory carries on with extraordinary grace through the church and school they established in 1437. Now, if you were willing to sit here and let me fiddle for a minute, the church and the school and the almshouses that they set up are still there 600 years later. They are still actively in use. There are still children in the school. So, and there's a thing about that right here, and you can.
Do you have the link?
I've got
type it in or,
what's it? What do you call that?
yeah. Oh, there's.
Okay, I'm not going to do this though. Okay, well, all right. I'll walk us through the images, and then I'll see if I can get the actual show. So you,
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Here it is. It's beautiful.
It confuses me. There are two different churches. I both claim to be the same church, but they look very different.
St. Mary the Virgin Church. And then the almshouses.
Yeah, and there are still people get to live in the almshouse if they're, an old person who doesn't have enough money to live on. They get to live in the almshouses, which is a lot nicer than how we treat people.
Yeah. Chapel of St. John the Baptist inside.
Oh, and look for the garter on her arm.
Okay. All right, and then we'll go. Okay. And there's the tomb. Here you see her just line top. Teresa needs to be here to see this. These tombs.
What?
Okay, so
Yeah,
there. Well, she's doing research on the saint's tomb, but these kind of recumbent
the
tombs are real interesting. No, we're not yet. That's Alice. Okay. Okay, there we are. Yeah, there it is on her left arm. It is interesting.
So and the tomb is very fancy, and there's a carving of her on the top, looking very saintly. And then what's underneath is a body, a desiccated human skeleton.
Yeah, that's crazy. You never see that really. That carved.
And above her, apparently there are things painted so that the skeleton is looking up.
Look up, yeah. Okay, right there, yeah. That is so unusual. That's interesting.
Maybe it's something French that she picked up.
Yeah.
From France.
Yeah. Okay, that was the last slide of it. So these tombs are interesting. And there's a little right.
Okay, so if you want to hang in there.
It was her son when she married him off.
Oh, hang on, let me do this first because I can't do things and think.
He must have been a bit older, I think.
Right. Well, what do I need to do? I need to
type
this in.
Okay, so HTTPS
AWELME primaryschool.com
backslash
about
hyphen 2.
Then
Yeah, the number 2.
Yeah, okay, I've got it.
Backslash. Yes. You probably need that final backslash. No, maybe not. I don't know that or not.
Right. There we go.
Yeah. Oh, there it is.
Okay, I was going to do this in pieces. I don't know if I can get away with that with all this confusion. All right, come on.
So it's a private school then, so it would
Here
be.
we are. I tried let's share with the.
Ireland is a very unique school in lots of different ways.
Okay,
The fact it's such a historic
Yeah.
setting makes it very special. Not many schools have a building that's 600 years old, and it has been a school for every single day of its 600-year history. So I think that makes it a very special, unique place. And perhaps the children, for them, it's just normal. But actually, they don't appreciate that not every child gets to go to such a special and historic place for their school. I think as much as the buildings are amazing and very special, actually it's the learning and the work and the children here that are most important. We try to focus on our kind of core values as a school of being ready, respectful, responsible, resilient, and reflective, which obviously link also to the kind of Christian ethos of the school as well. And so that by the time the children get to the end of year 6, they're not just ready for secondary school in terms of what they've learned, but also ready in terms of the way they behave, the values that they have, and the mindset they have as well. There's a strong community feel here. It's a small, close-knit village community where lots of people, lots of parents came here themselves as children, and then obviously bring their children here in turn. We also have our Ensign on our doorstep, which is an important part of the local community as well. And we're lucky to have lots of families from the area who come here too. So it creates a nice mix of different experiences. Here at UL, children start in reception class, which is called Chaucer class, because Alice Chaucer, the great-granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, originally set up the school back in 1437. So we've named the classes after different people linked to the school's history. So Chaucer class, as the founder of the school, is our foundation class, our first class, and that's for the children in reception and then year 1. And they work with Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Halliwell in that class. And when they first come into school, and they have an outside area that they can use with lots of interactive, independent activities.
Whoops.
Oh, does it go, but should I go to 447?
What happened?
Oh, I'm taking over
Oh, you're right.
447.
Okay, if that's what it says.
Yeah.
Unless you run here, the whole curriculum of all these cute little students.
All right, there's 446. So this is
This school's Christian ethos is really important. We're a Church of England school, and the Christian values run through everything that the school does and everything that the school is aiming to achieve. We have a really close link with our local church, which is actually part of the same complex of medieval buildings that the school is part of. And so we go to church on a weekly basis for an assembly that's run by and led by the local vicar. He has a really close relationship with the school and with myself. We work together on lots of different things. In the past, he's come and helped with Tuesday activities, with remembrance services and activities. Most recently, he contributed to our Harvest Festival and helped us collect food for the local food bank, which we then delivered. The school is organised into 4 classes. The youngest class is Chaucer class, which is year 1 and reception. And they have an open classroom and an outside area to use, meaning they can either mix and play together, or the classroom can be separated for them to be working and learning separately. We have Rowett class, which is year 2, and they work as a small class on their own as a single year group. We have Burgish class, which is year 3 and 4, and again they have a large classroom where they can either be working together or in separate year groups depending on the needs of the children and what the teachers planned. And there's the whole class, year 5 and 6, the oldest children in the school, where they obviously start to prepare for their move to secondary school. We're very lucky to have a large playing field, which the children absolutely love. It's got space for football, a climbing frame and trim trails. It's got an area with trees that the children love to play and explore in, and lots of wide open space for them to sort of run around, have fun, get off steam.
Let's go here to the very.
I really want to. I'm going to the build like quite literally. I'm gonna miss being in that classroom up there. It's gonna be, yeah, I'm gonna miss the actual school itself.
I would too. It's beautiful.
Right, send your kids there.
Yes. I bet it's a bargain. Well, thank you.
All right, everybody, and I hope everybody's online got most of this anyway.
Yeah.
They did,
Yeah.
because I was watching the transcription and it was catching all of your words. So.
Oh, turn on
Hang
the.
on, there we go.
Yeah.
So we actually had 6 online, but one of them was a group of 10 people that were watching us while doing feast prep for an event that they have tomorrow night.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So we had 20 of us totals.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, well, so how old was her son when she married him off roughly? He must have been older because they didn't marry off boys.
And I'd have to
Went
go back
over
on
whatever,
the
did they?
dates.
Yeah. I mean, because the boys would be older, right? They wouldn't be as young as the girls when they got married.
Not
Sometimes they
necessarily.
No,
were young,
because
I guess.
Elizabeth Berg married Lionel when he was
Oh, that's right, he's 4, yeah.
He got married. at
She was
4.
all of 10. My God, old woman.
You forgot that part.
Yeah, but it is interesting because in Italy also, if a woman left, the child stayed with her husband's family. So if he died, then they had the
Even a
child.
female child.
Yeah, and so, but she could take her dowry with her. That's what she could take. And so they would want to keep her there and keep her dowry. They wouldn't actually want her to leave because she could stay and raise her kid and keep her dowry there. But if she took her dowry, she had to leave her kid. So it was probably very similar, I guess. So,
Well, royal children
Yeah.
had to be brought back, didn't they? Royal
yeah, they had to
children.
be, yeah.
They brought them back into
brought them
the,
back
into
into
the
the-
kingdom,
Yeah, into
they
the
were
family, yeah,
born out there somewhere.
yeah.
Like, didn't Caesar go and get children from?
Don't know.
Hmm.
Bring children? I think he did. He went and got them after he left.
Yeah, well, I guess they're all dying left and right. You have to round up some birth.
Well, they belong back with
Yeah,
him,
back with the, yeah, they
Not-
did. Mhm.
not with her. And she's dead anyway.
Well, and so Alice really had kind of a good situation in many ways, because she got the husbands out of the way and then could just sort of relax.
Live the good life.
Live the good life.
Some of them might
And
have
had
liked
and been
their
able to keep
husbands.
her son.
They could have been
Yeah.
good guys.
Well, there is in Italian writing, there is some discussion every once in a while, like the Duke of Urbino, Federico de Montefeltro, he and his wife, it was an arranged marriage with Battista Sforza, but everyone said that they actually loved each other. And she would travel with him when he would go to war. She went too. But there's a lot of discussion like that they actually did care about each other, which is unusual. And then she died young in childbirth, of course. And so he was really devastated. And he never remarried or anything. So, but
I mean, yeah, I think William and Alice, I think that was a love marriage,
yeah,
or maybe more on his side.
yeah,
Um,
because they were closer in age, I
Yeah.
guess, at that point. So,
Yeah.
and they had a son, but I mean, that
Yeah.
kind of connects you. And
yeah. Yeah.
It's
Interesting.
actually, there's more about Alice. So I didn't want to go on forever, but once she got settled after the Wars of the Roses and whatever, she ended up being in East Anglia where William had been,
Mhm.
and there was the Wars of the Roses were so confusing. So if you're Lancastrian, you're a Yorkist, and then you decide I'm going to be a Yorkist and I'm going to be a whatever. I mean, people just kept switching what side they were on, and you would be the lord, and this would be one of your vassals, and you would given him this land that he could work in, and then you could, and you would have a house or something, and it could turn up, or some other, you're the Lancastrian, so some Yorks could turn up and say, well, the king is now the Duke of York is now king, and so this is
Yeah.
our house, and you have
Yeah.
to leave this house. And Alice played some of those games with some people. There's a family called the Pastons, like I talked about John Paston III.
Mhm.
The Pastons were from Norfolk, and they kept writing letters to each other. Because they'd go down to London to do things and whatever. And so it's like a really thick book of the past and letters, which include a lot of the Duchess of Suffolk or whatever, causing all this stress to people. And that's Alice. Alice's hobby was stressing out people in Norfolk.
Well, so when they were on the east and on the west, did they meet in London or did they go to each other's?
They did that kind of
Yeah, 'cause
stuff.
it seemed like London was kind of right there in the middle.
I mean, it would take a week or
Yeah,
something to get from,
forever to get,
the east side to
Yeah.
Oxfordshire.
yeah, that's very
and-
far.
Um, I guess everybody just probably worked at a slower pace,
Yeah,
If you're gonna go somewhere, you just know it's
Yeah.
gonna take a week.
yeah, and you have to travel so that people can see that you're there, that you still exist. Because the king, because the king of France would just travel all the time just so he, people could see him, so that he was
Mhm.
present everywhere. So
It
I'm
was,
sure it's.
and they would stop, they'd stop at some other lord's house, presumably, and then that lord would have to feed them and,
Yes, uh-huh.
Give them beds and stuff.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, and later they had those big houses specifically for that purpose, for Queen Elizabeth to come
Mm.
stand. I forget what those houses were called, but they were right on the roads. They built these big houses right on the roads. So as you're traveling along, you'll stay at these beautiful
Ah.
homes. What they're called, they have a particular name to them.
I never heard that.
Yeah. But-
Well, I appreciate,
Well,
thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
This is nice.
Rather odd.
This worked out really well, though, I think.
This is like a time.
I know, it was like your class.
It was like a class.
I
Yeah.
know.